Hello everyone, my name is Marc Schmalz. Welcome and thank you for attending this session to hear about our paper, Evaluating a Taxonomy for Video Game Development Artifacts, which comes out of the University of Washington Game Research Group. When we were performing this research and writing this paper, I was a doctoral candidate at the University of Washington Information School. I'm currently faculty at the Boise State University College of Business and Economics. Kylie and Tara are graduates of the University of Washington's MLIS program. Corey is a current MLIS student, Lidia is a current PhD student, and Dr. Jinha Lee is the director of the lab and our advisor. In 2018, the Institute of Museum and Library Services awarded our lab a grant to conduct a 2-year research project to create a conceptual data model and metadata schema for describing and representing artifacts related to the development of digital games. We also had assistance, participation, and support from board members at the Video Game History Foundation. But what are artifacts related to the development of video games? While game preservation has gained popularity among academics and institutions dedicated to preserving our cultural heritage, few have yet to focus on development artifacts, such as artwork, game development documents, musical scores, test builds, and marketing material. They focus on the finished game and not the development artifacts. But as with other media, development artifacts are vital for understanding and appreciating the history and context of produced works. In phase 1 of the grant, the Gamer Group Lab adopted a multi-method approach employing an examination of existing collections and 29 interviews within our 3 target populations: game creators, information professionals handling these collections, and game researchers. From these, we analyzed the embodied practices, expressed values, and perceived challenges of these stakeholders. We produced a taxonomy of game development artifacts and provided best practice recommendations for describing them. Which brings us to phase 2 of the grant, in which we performed an evaluation of the taxonomy we produced. First, we had to determine how we'd evaluate the TVGDA. We didn't really find specific guidance of the sort we'd hoped for, but we did find this paper by Robert C. Nickerson and collaborators that provided a set of criteria to consider. The project was both a test of the taxonomy and a report on the utility of Nickerson for our work. The outcomes both help improve the TVGDA and, we hope, help others use Nickerson's criteria. In terms of methods, we had a graduate metadata course classify 1,000 objects from an online digital archive, and we had 2 individuals tested on separate institutional physical collections. The work in the metadata class was redundant, with each object classified twice so that we could look at consistency, intercoder reliability, with which the terms were applied. The coders also left us comments and questions which were analyzed to identify trouble areas. Lastly, we conducted follow-up interviews with the individuals from the physical archives, where we reviewed and explored their classification work. The Nickerson criteria explain that a taxonomy should be comprehensive, concise, robust, explanatory, and extendable. Comprehensiveness is the quality of covering all objects in the domain, and also including enough dimensions to describe the domain. Starting with dimensionality first, well, we started with the unidimensional taxonomy. This is also related to robustness. I'll cover a little more there. With 123 terms, the TVGDA extensively covers the domain. Still, 20 comments from catalogers suggested new terms, usually narrower terms, for artifacts with niche purposes. We think it's interesting to uncover these niche terms, but believe that the level of specificity may not be required for most of our users. We also note that innovative domains will probably change often. Conciseness is the quality of parsimony and limited complexity, and is in tension with comprehensiveness, particularly coverage. With 123 terms, the TVGDA definitely seems to prefer coverness over conciseness. We had fairly low intercoder reliability among our MLIS students, and the sheer volume of terms might contribute to that problem. We suggest future work on reducing the number of broad terms and easing the conceptual load required for high-level classification, while interested parties can explore and use narrower terms for detail. Robustness is the quality of providing catalogers enough dimensions and characteristics to clearly differentiate the objects of interest. Where dimensionality, part of the comprehensive criterion, is about including all dimensions of an object's interest. So comprehensiveness is about completely describing artifacts, and robustness is about differentiating artifacts from one another. In practical terms, the recommendation for addressing both is the same. The team found that the TVGDA is hindered by not distinguishing artifacts' nature and function. You might be thinking, this is something information professionals like archivists deal with all the time. In our case, we also need to consider game professionals who don't have the training, don't have archivist training, and need to classify these items before accession. Explanatory is the quality of providing useful explanations of the nature of the object under study. We figured that if our taxonomy was explanatory, our description of the space would lead to agreement among coders about how each object should be classified. Our intercoder agreement was lackluster as best, as mentioned, and coders regularly commented that the artifacts were ambiguous to them. While failure to agree on terms does indicate room for improvement, we also can't really control ambiguity surrounding a given item or influence its context in an archive. Extendability is the capacity to be revised, and in short, ours can be revised. If we want to maintain our comprehensiveness, we must, since we're operating in an innovative domain. Extendable and comprehensive seem to be linked, too. Which brings us to a quick review of the Nickerson qualities as a tool for evaluating taxonomies. Our group didn't spend a lot of time on this, extendable, but we're not sure how any taxonomy itself would not be extendable. We're iffy on the actual utility of this criterion. It seems a matter of governance of the taxonomy and not of the taxonomy itself. Comprehensiveness has two subqualities, which we covered, but we didn't see any benefit to treating these as a single criterion. There is utility in both subcriteria, but perhaps not in grouping them together in this fashion. Conciseness and comprehensiveness are in tension and tied to cognitive load required to apply a taxonomy. People trying to adhere to both criteria are left to strike their own balance. Our suggestion for future work is to try to balance the number of broad and narrow terms to provide additional guidance for users on their use. Robust and explanatory also seem to be linked. Lacking full explanatory power in the taxonomy, our users often found that using more than one term helped them explain an artifact. This is complicated by ambiguous artifacts whose nature is explained through the taxonomy but not understood by the coders, perhaps due to lack of experience in the domain or with the collection. Considering screenshots, well, there are also fake screenshots, too commonly used for marketing, that are, in the common parlance, referred to as bullshots. Unless you're intimately familiar with these games, you won't realize that these are bullshots, not screenshots. This is part of our ambiguity problem. Many of the concerns our coders raised about objects seem to have multiple modes of evaluation. Troubles identified with the screenshot term could apply to both robust and comprehensive qualities, for example. Still, overall, we found that the Nickerson qualities were very useful in evaluating concepts, and we plan to use them in future research. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, and thank you for that, Mark. That was very interesting. I had not heard that term bullshot before, so added a new one.
I hadn't either until we started this project.
So I wanted to open it up for any questions. I don't see any in the chat, but if anybody who's listening in would like to either add it to the chat or feel free to turn on your camera and or microphone and ask.
And I will do my best. I have recently taken a position at Boise State University as an assistant professor, and I haven't really thought about this project much recently, aside from the presentation I tried to do, so I will do my best to answer the questions.
We do have one in the chat. Tracy, did you want to ask it?
Yeah, I was curious if you talked about inter-rater reliability and just the low number of people who chose the same term. Do you have a point of reference for other kinds of digitized materials for that? Like for how frequently catalogers will choose the same terms?
We don't. That's an interesting point. I don't know if we specifically looked for a level of intercredible reliability that we were supposed to achieve. One of the things that happened, we did the assignment, and then we realized that the way it was distributed, we couldn't guarantee that any given artifact had been, or any set had been done by the exact pairs that are required for Cohen's. I'm sorry, I'm going to screw up we couldn't use the standards for inter-rater reliability because we hadn't set up the thing correctly. So even if we had, what we did try to do though, in addition, so we ran stats for simple comparisons at multiple levels. So we checked to see if the exact same term was used, and we have a 3-level hierarchy. So we examined it at multiple levels of the hierarchy. And it did get somewhat better when we were talking about just the broader terms. But it was not very good when we were talking about the very specific terms. We did try to see if they were matched at the same level of the hierarchy. We have a lot of terms, and I think that's one of our problems. I think we did a good job at expressing the domain, all the things that we found and all the ways that the professionals were referring to it. I think that leaves a very messy space though.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions? And there'll be more time at the end as well, if you don't have one just yet.
And I can continue to babble while they come up. Part of the innovation is that new stuff might appear as well. And so there's a constant need to try to keep up to date with what the professionals are actually referring to things as, or what new artifacts appear because new technology has emerged. That might give another narrow term that some members of our audience do understand and others don't. That's part of the innovative process, is that it's not an established domain in that everybody knows what you're talking about at all times, right? The term bullshot, I'd been in digital games for a long time, I'd never heard it. The term beautiful corner, never heard it until I did an interview with a professional and found out other people use the term. So the fact that the domain is constantly changing means that our need to keep up with the terminology, it's a very difficult challenge to keep up with that terminology and to make it useful to both people who are active right now and using those terms and the other people who will come and look for those artifacts later.
Yes, Helen, did you have a question?
Yeah, a quick one. Just because Marc mentioned that the terminology constantly changing, I'm thinking from an archival perspective, when you use this taxonomy to apply to artifacts, I mean, is there a time dimension? Because some of these terms go out of fashion, new ones get added. How do you retrospectively know, the temporal dimension related to each term? And is there anything in that taxonomy that indicates that at all?
There isn't, and that's a fantastic observation. What we did is we looked at one of our archives was from someone who had been developing games in the 80s. And so we looked at those artifacts and we tried to name them the best we could. So we tried to get a spread of all of these terms, but as far as how terms fall out of fashion or how that might affect a hierarchy, that's an interesting concept that we really hadn't addressed.
Okay.
But it's definitely, I'm going to pass that back to Jin Ha and push her that way, because that's awesome.
Thank you.
My undergrad was also in history a long time ago, so anything historic is also interesting. Fan or community generated artifacts I see in the
in the chat. What we were looking at is official archives. There are other ways to, well, there are other sorts of objects that do exist. We did talk to someone about fanzines and how those are archived. So we have some sort of concept of that. I don't know, actually, I don't know if it was included. There was a big push to go from actual developer to archivist to historian. And so the original work may have downplayed a lot of that, the unofficial creations, but some of those do work into archives anyway. You get correspondence with people where those are passed, and so those end up in official archives. So I don't remember all 123 terms right now. There has to be some sort of representation of that in our in the section on organizational documents where we keep track of that sort of correspondence. But we didn't specifically go after fan-generated content. It was fan-generated content that happened to appear in official archives.
This is all really, really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Are there any other questions at this time? If not, we'll go ahead and switch it over. Thank you so much, Marc, for your presentation and for the discussion. Our next